Hey everyone, we're just 3 days away from the new year and we're making one final push for 5k subscribers. If you're enjoying the content, hitting subscribe is completely free and you can always unsubscribe later. Don't forget to tap that bell icon to get notified of new uploads. Every like and comment helps YouTube share our videos with more awesome people. Now let's jump into today's video. The Asteria, a sleek, deep space exploration vessel, drifted through the inky void of space, its crew eager to make a historic discovery. Captain Lena Ivanova, a seasoned commander with piercing blue eyes and an unwavering determination, sat in her chair on the bridge, surveying the endless expanse before her. The mission had been uneventful so far, with months spent charting uninteresting celestial bodies and collecting routine data. Suddenly, the ship's sensors lit up like a supernova, alarms blaring throughout the decks. The crew snapped to attention, frantically analyzing the incoming data. "Captain, we've detected an anomaly unlike anything we've ever seen," reported the ship's chief science officer, Dr. Aidan Reeves. His brow furrowed as he studied the readings, his fingers dancing across the holographic displays. Captain Ivanova leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What exactly are we looking at, Doctor?" Dr. Reeves shook his head in disbelief. "It's a region of space with an impossibly high concentration of dark matter. The density is off the charts, unlike anything that should exist naturally." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And there's something else, Captain. The dark matter appears to be arranged in an intricate pattern, almost like a labyrinth or prison." The bridge fell silent, the implications of Dr. Reeves's words sinking in. An artificial construct of dark matter hidden deep in uncharted space. It defied all known science and logic. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, a palpable tension filling the air. Captain Ivanova straightened in her chair, a steely resolve settling over her features. "We didn't come all this way to turn back at the first sign of the unknown," she declared. "We're explorers, and this is the discovery of a lifetime. Set a course for the anomaly, and prepare for a full investigation." The crew hesitated, their instincts screaming at them to flee, to leave this cosmic aberration well alone. But they were the best of the best, hand-picked for this mission, and they knew the importance of their duty. With a chorus of "Aye, Captain," they set to work, guiding the Asteria towards the dark matter prison. As the ship approached the anomaly, a sense of unease crept through the corridors, an almost tangible dread that clung to the recycled air. The dark matter construct loomed before them, a twisting, writhing mass of shadows and impossible geometry. It seemed to defy the very laws of physics, warping the fabric of space-time around it. Captain Ivanova's heart raced as she stared into the abyss, a primal fear clawing at the edges of her mind. She pushed it down, refusing to let it cloud her judgment. They had a mission to complete, and she would not let fear stand in the way of discovery. Little did she know, as the Asteria boldly forged ahead, that they were about to unleash a horror beyond their wildest nightmares. An ancient, malevolent presence stirred within the dark matter prison. An eldritch god that had been sealed away eons ago by forces beyond human comprehension. And now, unwittingly, the crew of the Asteria had stumbled upon its cosmic cage, setting in motion a chain of events that would unravel the very fabric of reality itself. The discovery had been made, but at what cost? As the ship crossed the threshold into the dark matter labyrinth, Captain Ivanova and her crew were about to find out, and the universe would tremble in their wake. As the Asteria cautiously approached the dark matter prison, the crew could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down upon them. The ship's sensors were going haywire, readings fluctuating wildly as they tried to make sense of the anomaly before them. Captain Ivanova gripped the armrests of her chair tightly, her knuckles turning white as she stared into the swirling vortex of darkness. "Captain, we're picking up some strange readings," Dr. Reeves reported, his voice trembling slightly. "It's almost as if..." as if the laws of physics are breaking down as we get closer. Ivanova nodded grimly, her jaw clenched. "Steady as she goes," she ordered. "We've come too far to turn back now." As the ship entered the dark matter labyrinth, reality itself seemed to warp and distort around them. The stars outside the viewport stretched into long, eerie streaks of light, and the very fabric of space-time rippled like the surface of a troubled pond. The crew watched in a mixture of awe and horror as the impossible became reality before their eyes. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness and nausea swept through the ship, causing several crew members to double over in pain. Strange whispers filled the air, an otherworldly language that seemed to bypass the ears and burrow directly into the mind. Captain Ivanova clutched her head, gritting her teeth against the psychic assault. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice strained. Dr. Reeves shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, Captain. It's like the anomaly is affecting our minds somehow. I've never seen anything like it." As the whispers grew louder and more insistent, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over the crew. It was as if the very air was thick with an ancient malevolence, a presence that had been waiting for eons to be unleashed upon the universe once more. The ship's systems began to malfunction one by one. Lights flickered and went out, plunging the corridors into an eerie, pulsating darkness. Consoles sparked and sputtered, spitting out garbled data and error messages. The Asteria groaned and shuddered, as if the ship itself was being twisted and deformed by the eldritch energies that surrounded it. "We need to get out of here," Captain Ivanova said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever this thing is, it's beyond our understanding. We're in over our heads." But it was too late. The dark matter prison had them in its grasp, and there was no turning back. The labyrinth seemed to shift and change around them, the twisting corridors rearranging themselves in impossible ways. The crew found themselves lost and disoriented, their sense of direction completely shattered. As they ventured deeper into the anomaly, the whispers grew louder, and strange visions began to assault their minds. They saw glimpses of an ancient cosmic horror, a being of pure malevolence and chaos that had been imprisoned by forces beyond their comprehension. The visions were fragmentary and disjointed, but one thing was clear: the entity was aware of their presence, and it wanted to be free. Captain Ivanova and her crew were now lost in the twisted corridors of the dark matter prison, their sanity and their very lives hanging by a thread. They had entered the labyrinth, but would they ever find their way out again? Or would they become just another footnote in the annals of cosmic horror, their fate sealed by the eldritch god that lurked within the shadows? Only time would tell as the Asteria and her crew ventured further into the heart of darkness, their destiny intertwined with the ancient, malevolent force that had been waiting for them since the dawn of time. The crew of the Asteria wandered through the endless, twisting corridors of the dark matter labyrinth, their minds reeling from the eldritch horrors that assaulted them at every turn. The walls seemed to pulse and throb with an unnatural energy, as if the very structure of the prison was alive and aware of their presence. The air was thick and cloying, filled with the stench of decay and the whispers of long-forgotten horrors. Captain Ivanova led the way, her face a mask of grim determination as she tried to keep her crew together. But with each passing moment, she could feel their sanity slipping away, the whispers and visions taking their toll on even the strongest among them. She knew that they had to find a way out, a way to escape this cosmic nightmare, before it consumed them all. But the labyrinth had other plans. The corridors seemed to shift and change without warning, leading them in circles and down dead ends. Doors that had once been open now slammed shut, trapping them in ever smaller spaces. The darkness pressed in on them from all sides, a tangible force that seemed to suck the very life from their bodies. And then the disappearances began. One by one, crew members vanished without a trace, their screams echoing through the twisted corridors before being abruptly cut off. Those who remained huddled together in small groups, their eyes wide with fear, and their hands trembling as they clutched their weapons. Dr. Reeves was one of the first to succumb to the madness. Ivanova found him babbling incoherently in a corner, his once brilliant mind shattered by the eldritch knowledge that had been forced upon him. He spoke of an ancient god, a being of pure chaos and destruction that had been imprisoned eons ago by forces beyond their understanding. The god was angry, he said, and it would stop at nothing to break free from its prison and wreak havoc upon the universe once more. Ivanova tried to comfort him, to bring him back from the brink of insanity, but it was no use. Dr. Reeves's eyes rolled back in his head and he began to convulse violently, his body twisting and contorting in impossible ways, and then, with a final, gut-wrenching scream, he simply vanished, his body dissolving into a cloud of dark matter that was quickly absorbed by the walls of the labyrinth. Ivanova stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to make sense of what she had just witnessed. But there was no time to dwell on the horror, no time to mourn the loss of her friend and colleague. The whispers were getting louder now, the visions more intense and disturbing. She could feel the ancient god's presence all around her, its malevolent gaze boring into her very soul. And then, as if from nowhere, the inhuman screams began. They echoed through the twisted corridors, a cacophony of agony and despair that sent shivers down Ivanova's spine. She and the remaining crew members pressed on, their weapons at the ready, but they all knew that they were no match for the horrors that lurked within the labyrinth. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a monstrosity that defied description. It was a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, its form constantly shifting and changing in ways that made their brains ache just to look at it. And in that moment, Ivanova knew that they were doomed, that the ancient god had finally found a way to break free from its prison. The crew of the Asteria had ventured too far, delved too deep into the secrets of the cosmos, and now, lost in the twisted corridors of the dark matter labyrinth, their sanity shattered and their lives hanging by a thread, they could only watch in horror as the ancient god began to manifest before them, its eldritch form taking shape in the darkness. The end was near, and there was no escape. As the crew of the Asteria stood frozen in horror before the manifestation of the ancient god, their minds were assaulted by a barrage of visions and memories that were not their own. They saw the god in its prime, a being of unimaginable power, a malevolence that had once held sway over entire galaxies. They witnessed the terrible wars and cataclysms that had been waged in its name, the countless civilizations that had been crushed beneath its iron heel. But they also saw the god's downfall, the moment when it had been betrayed and imprisoned by its own kind. The other gods had grown weary of its cruelty and destruction, and had banded together to create the dark matter prison that would hold it for all eternity. The ancient god had raged and screamed as it was sealed away, its power stripped from it and its essence scattered across the cosmos. Now, after eons of waiting, the god had found a way to reach out from its prison and influence the minds of those who ventured too close. It had latched onto the crew of the Asteria like a parasite, feeding off their fear and despair as it slowly regained its strength, and with each passing moment, the god's power grew, its form becoming more solid and tangible in the twisted corridors of the labyrinth. Captain Ivanova and her remaining crew members struggled to resist the god's influence, but it was a losing battle. They could feel its seething rage and thirst for revenge burning in their minds, threatening to consume them entirely. Some began to babble incoherently, their eyes glazing over as they succumbed to the madness that the god had unleashed upon them. Others turned on each other, their fear and paranoia overriding their loyalty and compassion. Ivanova watched in horror as two of her crew members, once the best of friends, tore at each other's throats with their bare hands, their screams of rage and pain echoing through the corridors. And through it all, the god watched and waited, its malevolent presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Ivanova could feel its gaze upon her, could hear its whispers in her mind, promising her power and glory if only she would submit to its will. She gritted her teeth and pushed the thoughts away, but she knew that she was fighting a losing battle. As the god's form began to solidify before them, Ivanova and her crew knew that they were running out of time. They had to find a way to stop the god before it could fully manifest, before it could break free from its prison and unleash its terrible power upon the universe once more. But how could they hope to defeat a being that had once held sway over entire galaxies? How could they stand against a force that had been imprisoned by the combined might of the other gods themselves? Ivanova knew that they were outmatched, that they were facing an enemy that was far beyond their understanding. And yet, even in the face of certain doom, she refused to give up hope. She rallied her crew, urging them to stand together against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. They would fight to the bitter end, she told them, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives to stop the god from breaking free. As the ancient god's form began to take shape before them, its terrible visage looming over them like a nightmare made flesh, Ivanova and her crew prepared themselves for the final battle. They knew that the odds were against them, that they were facing a foe that had once brought entire civilizations to their knees, but they also knew that they had no choice. The fate of the universe rested on their shoulders, and they would not let it fall without a fight. And so, with weapons drawn and hearts pounding, they charged forward into the darkness, ready to face whatever horrors the ancient god had in store for them. The final confrontation had begun, and the fate of all creation hung in the balance. As the crew of the Asteria charged forward to face the ancient god, they were suddenly engulfed in a maelstrom of psychic energy that brought them to their knees. The god's whispers, which had once been a subtle presence at the edge of their minds, now became an overwhelming force that threatened to shatter their very sanity. Each crew member found themselves trapped in a personal hell, their deepest fears and darkest desires brought to life by the god's insidious influence. Captain Ivanova watched in horror as her first officer, a man she had trusted with her life, began to mutilate himself with his own fingernails, tearing at his flesh as he screamed in agony. Another crew member, a young woman who had only recently joined the Asteria's ranks, began to laugh hysterically, her eyes rolling back in her head as she danced and spun in circles. Ivanova tried to reach her, to snap her out of the madness that had consumed her, but it was no use. The god's whispers had taken hold, and there was no turning back. And then, like a siren's call, the god began to speak to them directly, its voice a seductive purr that promised them everything they had ever desired. Power, wealth, immortality, all of it could be theirs, if only they would submit to the god's will and help it break free from its prison. Some of the crew, their minds already weakened by the horrors they had witnessed, began to succumb to the god's temptations. They dropped their weapons and began to chant in an ancient, guttural language that made Ivanova's skin crawl. She watched in horror as they started to work on undoing the metaphysical chains that bound the god. Their eyes glazed over with a fanatic fervor. Others, like Ivanova herself, tried to resist the god's influence, but it was a constant battle. Every moment was a struggle to maintain their focus, to keep their minds from being consumed by the god's insidious whispers. Ivanova could feel her willpower eroding with each passing second, the god's psychic assault chipping away at her defenses until she was left raw and exposed. She knew that they were running out of time. The god's power was growing stronger by the moment, and soon even those who had resisted its influence would be overwhelmed. They had to find a way to stop the god, to seal it away once more before it could break free and unleash its terrible power upon the universe. But how could they hope to fight against a being that could manipulate their very thoughts and desires, How could they stand against a force that had brought even the strongest among them to their knees? Ivanova gritted her teeth and pushed forward, her mind a whirlwind of desperate plans and half-formed strategies. And then, just when all seemed lost, Ivanova saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. One of her crew members, a quiet and unassuming man named Dr. Samir Patel, had managed to slip away from the god's influence and was now working frantically on a small, handheld device. Ivanova's heart leapt with sudden hope. Dr. Patel was one of the Asteria's most brilliant scientists, a man who had spent his entire life studying the mysteries of the universe. If anyone could find a way to stop the god, it was him. She fought her way through the chaos and madness that surrounded her, dodging the blows of her own crew members as they succumbed to the god's influence. With a final, desperate lunge, she reached Dr. Patel's side and saw what he was working on. A miniaturized version of the same technology that had been used to create the dark matter prison itself. "Can it work?" she asked, her voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. Dr. Patel nodded grimly. "It's our only chance," he said, "but we'll need to get close to the god, closer than we've ever been before. And even then, there's no guarantee." Ivanova didn't hesitate. She knew what had to be done, and she was ready to sacrifice everything to see it through. With a nod to Dr. Patel, she turned to face the ancient god once more, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. They would stop this thing, no matter the cost. They would seal it away once more, or die trying. The fate of the universe hung in the balance, and she would not let it fall. With Dr. Patel's device in hand, Captain Ivanova rallied the few remaining crew members who had managed to resist the ancient god's influence. They gathered in a tight circle, their faces grim and determined as they prepared for the final confrontation. But even as they steeled themselves for battle, a new threat emerged from within their own ranks. Those who had succumbed to the god's whispers turned on their former comrades, their eyes blazing with a fanatic light as they attacked with a savage fury. Ivanova and her loyal crew fought back with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The once orderly corridors of the Asteria became a chaotic battleground, the air thick with the stench of blood and the screams of the dying. In the midst of the fighting, Ivanova caught a glimpse of her chief security officer, a man named Viktor Kovalev, locked in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle with one of the god's thralls. Kovalev was a formidable fighter, his body honed by years of training and combat experience, but even he was no match for the unnatural strength and speed of his opponent, who seemed to shrug off even the most devastating blows with ease. Ivanova watched in horror as Kovalev was slowly overwhelmed, his body battered and broken by the relentless onslaught. With a final, desperate cry, he fell to the ground, his chest torn open by the razor-sharp claws of his attacker. But even as Kovalev breathed his last, the creature that had once been his crewmate continued its assault, its body twisting and deforming as the ancient god's power coursed through its veins. Ivanova and her remaining allies could only watch in horror as the thing that had once been human transformed into a monstrous abomination, its flesh writhing with unnatural life. More and more of the crew fell to the god's influence, their bodies reanimated as twisted servants of its malevolent will. Ivanova and her few remaining allies found themselves surrounded on all sides, fighting a desperate battle against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. In the chaos, Dr. Patel was separated from the group, his fate unknown. Ivanova could only hope that he had managed to find a way to complete his work on the containment device, their last hope of stopping the ancient god before it could break free from its prison. But even as she fought on, Ivanova could feel her own mind beginning to fray at the edges, the god's whispers growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. She knew that she was on the brink of madness, that the very fabric of her sanity was beginning to unravel. And yet, even in the face of certain doom, she refused to give up. With a final, defiant roar, she rallied her remaining crew and charged forward, determined to fight to the bitter end. They would stop the god, or die trying, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives and souls in the process. As the battle raged on, the ancient god's power continued to grow, its dark presence filling the twisted corridors of the Asteria like a physical force. Reality itself began to warp and distort, the laws of physics bending and breaking under the weight of the god's malevolent influence. Ivanova knew that they were running out of time. If they didn't find a way to stop the god soon, it would break free from its prison and unleash its terrible power upon the universe, consuming everything in its path. But even as the situation seemed hopeless, Ivanova refused to give in to despair. She had sworn an oath to protect the innocent, to stand against the darkness no matter the cost, and she would fulfill that oath, even if it meant sacrificing her own life in the process. With a final, desperate charge, she and her remaining crew plunged into the heart of the battle, their weapons blazing as they fought to reach the ancient god and put an end to its reign of terror once and for all. The fate of the universe hung in the balance, and they would not let it fall. In the heart of the dark matter prison, the ancient god's power reached a terrifying crescendo. Reality itself began to unravel, the very fabric of space and time warping and twisting under the weight of the god's malevolent influence. Captain Ivanova and her few remaining allies fought their way through the chaos, their minds and bodies pushed to the very limit of endurance. They had lost so much already, friends, comrades, even their own sanity. But still, they pressed on, driven by a desperate hope that they could somehow find a way to stop the god before it was too late. At the center of the maelstrom, they found the god's loyalists gathered around a pulsing, writhing mass of dark energy. They were chanting in an ancient, guttural language, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to echo through the very fabric of reality itself. Ivanova knew instinctively that this was the key to the god's prison, the final seal that held it in place. And she knew too that the loyalists were close to breaking that seal, to unleashing the god upon the universe once more. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Ivanova and her team charged forward, their weapons blazing as they fought to reach the ritual before it could be completed. But the loyalists were ready for them, their bodies twisted and deformed by the god's power, their minds consumed by an unquenchable thirst for destruction. The battle was fierce and bloody, a desperate struggle fought in the heart of a nightmare. Ivanova watched in horror as her comrades fell one by one, their bodies torn apart by the fanatic fury of the god's servants. And then, just when all seemed lost, a miracle happened. Dr. Patel emerged from the shadows, his containment device held high in trembling hands. With a final, desperate cry, he activated the device, pouring all of his remaining strength and will into the task. The effect was immediate and devastating. A blinding flash of light filled the chamber, a searing, purifying radiance that seemed to burn away the god's darkness like a cleansing flame. The loyalists screamed in agony, their bodies dissolving into clouds of dark matter as the god's power was ripped away from them. For a moment, Ivanova dared to hope that they had done it, that they had stopped the god and saved the universe from its terrible fate. But then, with a final, horrifying roar, the ancient god itself emerged from the heart of the dark matter prison, its form a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, its power undiminished by the containment device. Reality shattered like a pane of glass, the laws of physics unraveling as the god's presence filled the chamber. Ivanova felt her mind beginning to splinter under the weight of the god's psychic assault, her very sanity crumbling away like sand before the tide. But even in the face of certain doom, she refused to give up. With a final, defiant roar, she rallied her remaining team and charged forward, determined to buy Dr. Patel the time he needed to complete his work. They fought with a savage fury, their weapons and bodies pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Ivanova felt bones shatter and muscles tear, but still she fought on, driven by a desperate, unquenchable will to survive. And then, just as the god's power reached its terrifying apex, Dr. Patel's voice rang out across the chamber. "It's done," he cried, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and triumph. "The device is ready." With a final, desperate surge of strength, Ivanova and her team fought their way to Dr. Patel's side. Together, they activated the containment device, pouring all of their remaining power and will into the task. The effect was cataclysmic. The chamber was filled with a blinding, searing light, a radiance that seemed to consume everything in its path. The ancient god screamed in agony, its form dissolving into nothingness as the device tore it apart, atom by atom. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the dark matter prison itself began to collapse, its walls crumbling away like sand before the tide. Ivanova knew that they had only moments left before the entire structure collapsed, burying them all in an eternal tomb of twisted metal and eldritch energy. With a final, desperate effort, she and her remaining crew fought their way to the escape pods, their bodies battered and broken, their minds pushed to the very edge of madness. They had bought themselves a chance, however slim, to escape the collapsing labyrinth and warn the galaxy of the horrors they had witnessed. But even as they fled, Ivanova knew that their battle was far from over. The ancient god may have been defeated, but its influence still lingered, a malevolent presence that threatened to consume everything in its path. And deep in the heart of the shattered prison, something stirred in the darkness, a final, terrible legacy of the god's power. Though its physical form had been destroyed, the god's essence still endured, waiting for the day when it could rise again and claim its terrible vengeance upon the universe that had dared to defy it. The crew of the Asteria had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And as Ivanova and her battered crew fled into the unknown, they knew that they would have to be ready for whatever horrors the future might hold, for the sake of all life in the universe. As the dark matter prison collapsed around them, Captain Ivanova and the surviving members of her crew raced through the twisting corridors, their hearts pounding with a desperate urgency. They had defeated the ancient god, but at a terrible cost. Their ship was in ruins, their comrades were dead or worse, and their own minds had been pushed to the very brink of madness. Dr. Patel led the way, his face a mask of grim determination as he navigated the labyrinth with an almost preternatural sense of direction. Ivanova knew that he was their best hope of escape, the only one among them who truly understood the eldritch technology that had created this nightmarish prison. But even as they fled, the god's influence continued to pursue them, a malevolent presence that seemed to seep into the very walls and corridors of the disintegrating structure. Strange, twisted creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms warped and distorted by the god's power, their eyes blazing with an unholy hunger. Ivanova and her crew fought them off as best they could, their weapons blazing in the darkness, their bodies pushed to the very limits of endurance. But for every creature they killed, two more seemed to take its place, an endless tide of horror that threatened to overwhelm them at any moment. And then, just when all seemed lost, they reached the escape pods, a small, battered fleet of vessels that represented their last, desperate hope of survival. But as they prepared to board, a final horror emerged from the shadows, a monstrous, tentacled beast that seemed to be made of pure, living darkness, its form pulsing with an unholy power. Ivanova knew instinctively that this was the god's final guardian, a creature birthed from the very essence of its being, and she knew too that they could not hope to defeat it, not with their weapons, not with their technology, not even with the eldritch device that Dr. Patel had used to destroy the god itself. In that moment, Ivanova made a decision. A final, desperate sacrifice that would buy her crew the time they needed to escape. With a wordless cry of defiance, she charged forward, her weapon blazing, her body a blur of motion as she fought to keep the creature at bay. Behind her, Dr. Patel and the others raced to the escape pods, their faces grim with the knowledge of what their captain was doing. They knew that they could not help her, that any attempt to do so would only doom them all. But still, it tore at their hearts to leave her behind, to abandon her to a fate worse than death. As the escape pods blasted free from the collapsing prison, Ivanova fought on, her mind a maelstrom of pain and desperation, her body pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. She felt the creature's tentacles wrap around her, felt its unholy power seeping into her very soul, but still she fought on, determined to buy her crew every last second of time. And then, with a final horrific scream, the creature tore her apart, but not before she had seen the escape pods vanish into the depths of space, carrying her crew to safety. In that final, terrible moment, Ivanova knew that she had succeeded, that she had given her life to save the people she loved, the people she had sworn to protect. As the darkness claimed her, Ivanova felt a strange sense of peace, a final, quiet acceptance of her fate. She had done her duty, had given everything she had to save her crew and the countless billions of lives that the ancient god had threatened. And though she knew that her own story was ending, she took comfort in the knowledge that her sacrifice had not been in vain, that her crew would carry on the fight, would stand against the darkness, no matter the cost. As the last traces of the dark matter prison collapsed into nothingness, the escape pods carrying the surviving members of the Asteria's crew sped away into the depths of space, battered, broken, but alive. But even as they fled, they knew that their ordeal was far from over, for the god's essence still lingered out there in the darkness, waiting for the day when it could rise again and claim its revenge. The crew had been through hell, but they were not broken. They had seen the abyss, had stared into the very heart of madness itself, but they had not succumbed. And as they raced towards an uncertain future, they knew that they would need every ounce of strength and courage they possessed to face the challenges that lay ahead, for the war against the darkness was far from over, and the crew of the Asteria would be on the front lines, ready to fight, to the bitter end, no matter the cost. They would carry on the legacy of their fallen captain, would honour her sacrifice by standing against the horrors that threatened the very fabric of the universe itself. And though the road ahead was dark and uncertain, they knew that they would not falter, for they were the guardians of light, the last line of defence against the darkness that sought to consume all life. The crew of the Asteria had been forged in the fires of hell, but they had emerged stronger, more determined than ever to protect the innocent and safeguard the future of the galaxy. And as they raced towards the unknown, they knew that they would need every ounce of that strength and determination to face the challenges that lay ahead. But even in the face of the darkness, there was still hope, a flickering flame that refused to be extinguished, no matter how deep the shadows grew. And as long as that flame endured, as long as there were still those willing to stand against the darkness, the crew of the Asteria knew that there was still a chance for the galaxy to survive, and for the light to triumph over the darkness, once and for all. Adrift in the void of space, the battered escape pod carried the sole survivor of the Asteria's crew, a haunted, broken figure who had seen the very depths of hell itself. Inside the cramped confines of the pod, Dr. Samir Patel sat hunched over the controls, his face a mask of grief and exhaustion. He had watched his crewmates die, had seen them consumed by the eldritch horrors of the dark matter prison. He had watched Captain Ivanova sacrifice herself to buy them time to escape, had felt the weight of her loss like a physical blow, and now, as he drifted through the endless expanse of space, He knew that he was utterly alone, the last living soul to bear witness to the horrors they had uncovered. For days, Dr. Patel sent out distress signals on every frequency he could think of, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, would hear his call and come to his aid. But the vastness of space was unforgiving, and his pleas went unanswered, nothing but the cold, empty silence of the void. As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Patel felt his mind beginning to fray at the edges, the weight of his trauma and the utter isolation of his situation taking their toll on his sanity. He became consumed by visions of the horrors he had witnessed, the writhing tentacles of the eldritch god, the twisted, mutated forms of his crewmates as they were consumed by its power. But even as he felt the last vestiges of his sanity slipping away, Dr. Patel clung to one final, desperate hope, the knowledge that he had to warn others of the terrible threat that lurked out there in the darkness. With trembling hands, he recorded a final message, a warning to all who would listen. "To anyone who finds this message," he began, his voice hoarse and trembling with exhaustion, "my name is Dr. Samir Patel, the sole survivor of the Asteria mission. We found something out there in the depths of space, an ancient, eldritch god imprisoned within a labyrinth of dark matter. We thought we could contain it, thought we could harness its power for the good of all mankind. But we were wrong. So very, very wrong. The god was too powerful, too malevolent to be controlled. It consumed my crewmates, twisted them into abominations of flesh and bone. And though we managed to destroy its physical form, I know that its essence still lingers out there in the darkness, waiting to be reborn. I have seen the true face of the universe, a cold, uncaring void that cares nothing for the lives of the insignificant specks that inhabit it. And I've seen the terrible things that lurk within that void, horrors beyond the comprehension of the human mind, horrors that seek to unmake the very fabric of reality itself. So I send this message as a warning, and as a call to arms. We must stand together against the darkness, must unite in the face of the terrible threats that seek to consume us all. For if we fail, if we falter in our resolve, then all that we hold dear will be lost forever, and the universe will be plunged into an eternal night from which there is no awakening. With a final, shuddering breath, Dr. Patel ended his message, a lingering silence filling the escape pod as he gazed out into the endless expanse of space. He knew that he did not have long left. The life support systems were failing, the air growing thin and stale with each passing moment. But even as he felt his own life slipping away, Dr. Patel took comfort in the knowledge that he had done all he could, that he had given the galaxy a chance, however slim, to prepare for the horrors that lurked out there in the darkness. With a final, weary smile, Dr. Samir Patel closed his eyes and embraced the cold, infinite peace of oblivion. But though Dr. Patel's story had ended, the tale of the Asteria's crew was far from over, for unbeknownst to the dying scientist, his message had been received, a garbled, fragmentary transmission that had been intercepted by a passing ship. And as that ship's crew played back the message, their faces growing pale with horror at the terrible revelations contained within, they knew that they had stumbled upon a truth that would change the course of history, a truth that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy itself. For Dr. Samir Patel had been right. The ancient god's essence still lingered out there in the darkness, a malevolent presence that threatened to consume all of creation. And though the crew of the Asteria had given their lives to stop it, their sacrifice had only bought the galaxy a temporary reprieve, a brief moment of calm before the storm that was to come. The fight against the darkness was far from over, and the crew of the Asteria had been only the first to fall in the terrible war that was to come. But though the future was uncertain, though the road ahead was fraught with peril, there was still hope. A fragile, flickering flame that refused to be extinguished, no matter how deep the shadows grew. And as the galaxy braced itself for the coming darkness, as brave men and women across the stars steeled themselves for the fight ahead, they knew that they would need every ounce of courage and determination they possessed to face the horrors that lurked within the void. But even in the face of the abyss, there was still light, a glimmer of hope that shone out amidst the darkness, guiding the way forward for all those who dared to follow. The legacy of the Asteria would endure, a shining beacon of sacrifice and bravery that would inspire countless others to take up arms against the darkness, no matter the cost. And though the road ahead was long and treacherous, though the horrors that awaited them were beyond their worst imaginings, they knew that they would not falter, for they were the guardians of the light, the last line of defense against the coming storm. And so the galaxy prepared for war, a terrible cataclysmic conflict that would shake the very foundations of reality itself. But even as the shadows gathered, even as the darkness threatened to consume all of creation, there was still hope, a fragile, precious thing that burned bright against the night, guiding the way forward for all those who dared to dream of a better tomorrow. Eons passed and the galaxy moved on, the terrible events of the Asteria's mission fading into myth and legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the darkened corners of seedy spaceport bars and the echoing halls of ancient ruins. But though the story of the eldritch god and its dark matter prison had been all but forgotten, the evil that the Asteria's crew had unleashed continued to fester and grow in the depths of space, a malevolent presence that waited patiently for the right moment to strike. And then, on a distant, unnamed world, an ancient evil stirred once more. A team of explorers, drawn to the planet by strange energy readings and whispered rumors of untold riches, stumbled upon a hidden chamber deep beneath the planet's surface, a twisted, eldritch labyrinth that pulsed with an unnatural, sickening light. At the heart of the labyrinth, they found an ancient artifact, a crumbling alien device that thrummed with another worldly power. And as they reached out to claim their prize, the device pulsed once more, and the explorers screamed in agony as their minds were flooded with visions of an ancient, terrible evil. In that moment, they saw the true face of the universe, a cold, uncaring void that cared nothing for the lives of the insignificant specks that inhabited it. They saw the terrible things that lurked within that void, horrors beyond the comprehension of the human mind, horrors that sought to unmake the very fabric of reality itself. And they saw the god, the ancient, terrible being that had been unleashed upon the galaxy once before, the malevolent entity that had consumed the crew of the Asteria and threatened to plunge all of creation into an eternal night. With their minds shattered and their souls consumed by the eldritch power of the artifact, the explorers became the god's new servants, twisted, monstrous beings that set out to spread their master's influence across the stars. And as they carved a path of destruction and madness through the galaxy, the ancient evil that had been unleashed upon the universe once before began to stir once more. A terrible, cosmic horror that threatened to consume all of existence. But even as the darkness gathered, even as the shadows grew ever deeper, there were still those who dared to stand against the coming storm. On a distant space station, a ragtag group of survivors, the descendants of the Asteria's crew, those who had been forged in the fires of the terrible conflict that had consumed their ancestors, banded together to fight the growing tide of madness and destruction. Among them was a woman named Alara Ivanova, the great-great-granddaughter of Captain Lena Ivanova, the brave commander who had sacrificed everything to buy her crew the chance to escape the dark matter prison. Alara had grown up on stories of her ancestors' bravery and sacrifice, and now, As the galaxy teetered on the brink of oblivion, she knew that she had to take up the mantle of her family's legacy and fight for the survival of all that she held dear. Together with her fellow survivors, a motley crew of soldiers, scientists and adventurers from across the galaxy, Alara set out to uncover the secrets of the eldritch god and its dark matter prison to find a way to stop the ancient evil before it could consume the galaxy once more. Their journey would take them to the farthest reaches of space, to ancient alien worlds and the twisted, nightmarish realms of the god's dark matter labyrinth. They would face horrors beyond their darkest imaginings, monstrous abominations of flesh and bone, eldritch beings of pure, malevolent energy, and the twisted, corrupted remnants of those who had fallen to the god's influence. But even in the face of such overwhelming odds, Alara and her companions refused to give up hope. They fought with all the courage and determination of their ancestors, the brave men and women who had given their lives to stop the god's reign of terror centuries before. And as they delved deeper into the secrets of the eldritch labyrinth, as they uncovered the terrible truth of the god's origins and the cosmic forces that had imprisoned it eons ago, Alara and her crew began to understand the true scope of the threat they faced, and the terrible price they would have to pay to stop it. In the end, their journey would take them to the very heart of the god's power, the crumbling ancient prison where the Asteria's crew had made their final stand centuries before. There, in a cataclysmic battle that shook the very foundations of reality itself, Alara and her companions would face the god in all its terrible cosmic horror, a being of pure malevolent energy that sought to consume all of creation. The battle was long and terrible, a desperate struggle against an enemy that seemed to defy the very laws of reality itself. But even in the face of such overwhelming power, Alara and her crew refused to give up hope. They fought with all the courage and determination of their ancestors, the brave men and women who had given their lives to stop the god's reign of terror centuries before. In the end, it was Alara herself who struck the final blow. A desperate, last-ditch effort that shattered the god's physical form and sent its essence screaming back into the depths of the dark matter prison. But even as the ancient evil was banished once more, Alara knew that their victory had come at a terrible cost. For the god's power had left its mark upon the galaxy, a twisted, corrupting influence that would linger for generations to come. As the survivors of the terrible battle returned to the space station they had once called home, they knew that their struggle was far from over. The galaxy had been forever changed by the events of the Asteria's mission, and now, as a new age dawned, they would have to fight harder than ever to protect the fragile peace they had won. For though the god had been defeated, its influence still lingered, a malevolent presence that threatened to consume all of creation. And as Alara and her crew looked out across the stars, they knew that they would have to be vigilant, for in the depths of space, an ancient cosmic horror still waited, biding its time until the day when it could rise again and plunge the galaxy into an eternal night. The cycle had begun anew, a terrible, recurring pattern of darkness and light, of hope and despair that would shape the destiny of the galaxy for eons to come. And as the crew of the space station prepared for the struggles that lay ahead, they knew that they would have to be ready, for the fate of the universe itself hung in the balance, and only the bravest and most determined among them would be able to stand against the coming storm. With each passing day, Alara and her crew would face new challenges, new dangers, and new threats. But no matter how deep the shadows grew, no matter how dark the future seemed, they would not falter. For they were the heirs of the Asteria's legacy, the last line of defense against the cosmic horrors that lurked out there in the dark. And as long as there were those who dared to dream of a better tomorrow, as long as there were those who refused to give in to despair, the flame of hope would never be extinguished. and the light would always find a way to shine through the darkness, no matter how deep the abyss might be.